Hi, it's Cole from Cole's Quilts, and welcome to week 8 of the Castle Dreamer Quilt Along. There's something new in the pattern now that I wanted to come on to talk about. If you've done some of my patterns before, then you may already know this. All of the blocks up to this point have been one section. Some of the blocks now from this point forward are going to be more than one section. What I mean by that is, if we look at this example, this is our first block that's two sections, A9. You'll notice that it says A9-1 and A9-2. And this is because this can't really be done all together as one section. So you will notice that there is a perforated line right there. And so the way you're going to do this is you're going to cut along that line. Now we're going to sew the fabric onto these two pieces, and then we're going to be sewing them back together. Here are my two pieces that I've done separately. We only have this one seam, so I like to baste right along the seam allowance to keep the fabric in place while I'm sewing this together. Otherwise this would flop. There are a lot of other ways you could do that. Also notice on this one that quite a bit of extra fabric here and here. I've said before in some videos, I'm not the type of person that like measures out exactly. I like to grab larger pieces than I need, but when I trim this off, I will put it in my scraps bag. And anytime I'm working on a piece that needs a small piece, I dig through my scraps bag. We're gonna trim these down and then we're gonna sew them together. So you'll notice that this is a seam allowance that I've drawn on, but now that we have two sections, right here where I cut, there's no seam allowance that has paper. So we're gonna measure our own seam allowance. I know that this is different from a lot of other patterns, and I had another video where I discussed why I did that. The main reason is that if I made all the pieces separate with seam allowance all the way around, it would like almost double the number of pages in my patterns, and my patterns are already really big. But it works out just fine. There's also less paper to pull out. So we're gonna trim these, and then we're gonna use this line to match them up to sew them together. So you wanna make sure when you are trimming it, on the outside where we have the seam allowance, I'm gonna be lining up my 1/4 inch ruler line with this line right here. And when I'm trimming the part that doesn't have the seam allowance on the paper, I'm going to line my 1/4 inch line right up with the edge of the paper and trim a 1/4 inch past that. Once you're done trimming it, you're going to match it up using a pin, and you're going to line that pin up at the very edge of the paper where you see the line that's outside of the block, not including the seam allowance. And I'm going to do that on both sides. And that will help me make sure that I'm lining it up properly. When you sew the two pieces together, normally when you're sewing other parts of the block, you're sewing on the line. So when you sew these two pieces together and there isn't paper in the seam allowance, you want your needle to be right up to the edge of the paper, but not actually sewing the paper. And you want to make sure that your two edges of your fabric seam allowance are lined up. Once we've sewn that, we're going to press the seam allowance, and now we have our first two section block. So this is what we have so far for week 8. Thanks for following along and doing this quilt along. It's going to be going through March. And if you get to a point where any of this seems like overwhelming or you feel like there isn't enough information in this video, remember that I do have a beginning foundation paper piecing class on my Cole's Quilts Academy website. And so I'll put a link down below in case you want to do that first. I've tried making some easier patterns. This I would say is one of my easier patterns, but most of my patterns end up being pretty intermediate. Happy quilting!